Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, In the Rut, Mating Season in Yellowstone, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Charlie Reinertsen. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Over to you, Charlie.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. Today we're going to be diving into one of my favorite places in the world, Yellowstone National Park and Grand Teton National Park. And this is really timely for me because I'll be heading out to guide a trip this weekend. And so a lot of these photos have been taken on NatHab trips. And just to give you a quick overview of what to expect from today's chat, I'll introduce myself and then we'll talk about wildlife activity and what's unique about this season in terms of what wildlife are doing in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And then we'll go into an itinerary overview just to give you a sense of what it's like to travel with natural habitat adventures in this ecosystem and the places that I'll be heading next week with my group starting on Sunday. So just a little bit about me. I grew up in the Northwoods in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And right now I live in Adirondack Park, which doesn't look too different than this picture, which was taken in the Upper Peninsula. And my background is in the population genetics of softshell turtles. So I spent a year trapping turtles in the Mississippi River and studying the differences between two species in particular of this softshell turtle. And ultimately that research really led to being able to identify that this species in particular, the smooth softshell, had significantly less genetic diversity than the spiny softshell turtle. And it helped the Minnesota DNR be able to prioritize habitat conservation for this species. So I love turtles. I love all things, reptiles and amphibians. And that love really spurred a career in science communications. And so I've done work for a number of different publications and most recently developed a 3,000 square foot exhibit at the Wild Center. And that brought me to live in Saranac Lake, where I'm calling in from today. And through all this work, partnering with different organizations to be able to capture images for them and tell their stories, I started working with Natural Habitat Adventures and World Wildlife Fund 2 years ago. And currently I guide in Yellowstone, in the Grand Canyon, and also in Michoacan, Mexico for the monarch migration. But today, we'll go ahead and dive into autumn wildlife activity in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So just to take a quick look at some of the characters that we'll be talking about today, we'll cover what's happening with pronghorn, moose, bison, elk, mule deer, and bighorn sheep. And these are what we call our ungulates, the hoofed animals. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about is really related to migration, and we'll definitely touch on the rut and what's happening there. But I really want to highlight some amazing work that's been coming out of the University of Wyoming, as well as other research partners who have come together under this umbrella of the Wyoming Migration Initiative. And essentially, the research that they are publishing in the last decade has completely turned on its head everything that we thought we knew about large mammal wildlife movements in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So this map that we're looking at here is what we currently know about wildlife migration routes of these big ungulates, what we like to call the charismatic megafauna. And this map itself, in the very center of it, you can barely read Grand Teton National Park, and that large square-ish sized outline is Yellowstone National Park. So the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is this vast area that expands beyond the boundaries of those national parks and goes out into ranch land, into private land, into national forest, into various different land ownerships. And so these wildlife migrations are covering these vast distances that we didn't know about. And they're entering lands that they might struggle to be able to cross. And so We're learning all of this data, and all of a sudden it's coming to the forefront because the technology has shifted. So the technology that we used to rely on, the name that you might know is the Craighead brothers. They were doing a lot of research with radio telemetry, and then a lot of scientists have tagged on with them since then doing that. And essentially that relies on a radio collar transmitter that connects to a transceiver, and the biologist is in the field trying to figure out where the animals are in the landscape. And they have to be able to be within range of the radio transmitter collar to be able to pick up a beep. And the frequency of that beep tells them how close they are. And so they can use those telemetry signals to be able to figure out the positioning of the animal. And as you can imagine, that gives them one data point for a single day, and maybe they spent weeks trying to find that animal because these ecosystems are incredibly vast and these animals are moving huge distances. So it's not surprising that when we had GPS collars invented and we could suddenly know in real time where these animals are and track their movements across time, that's when we had this massive explosion in understanding how these big animals are moving across the landscape. So just diving a little bit closer here, you're seeing these different colors represent the movements of these different animals that we introduced in the beginning of the talk. And so you're getting a closer up view of that outline of Yellowstone National Park with Yellowstone Lake in the center of it, and all these squiggly lines going all the way around it. So those are the movements of wildlife over the course of a year. And as you can tell, you might see the same color in a lot of different areas, and that's representing different populations. So when you look at mule deer in Yellowstone National Park, they might have multiple populations that do fundamentally different migrations throughout the year. We're talking about huge landscapes, so many individuals in each population. And so then you start to get this information. So here's a couple pieces that are really interesting coming from this. So this slide here is showing spring migration, and it's breaking down pronghorn, mule deer, and elk, and the amount of days that those animals are spending in between their summering range and their wintering range. So you can see here, these days, they're roughly spending a month moving from one to the other. When you look at the fall migration for these same animals, it's really interesting because pronghorn just cover the distance as quickly as they can. In 4 days, they can move all the way from the southern range of Grand Teton National Park all the way down to their winter range on the Red Desert. Mule deer are taking about the same amount of time as they would in the spring, and elk are sorry, not the same. So this is the comparison here. Mule deer are taking about 3 times as long to get there in the fall, and then elk are spending about the same amount of time. And so this is really interesting because this information is so brand new. The scientists are starting to analyze this and try to understand, what does this mean? And just to break down one of these pathways, here's a map showing the elk populations in and around Yellowstone National Park. So each of those arrows kind of shows a spring migration that those animals are making. So this is back to that concept that each of these species has different populations and they're each completing a different migration. And today we're going to talk a bit about why are they doing this and what do we know about it currently and what are some of the questions that we're still asking. So this is really exciting for someone like me who's been, when I started, learning about the ecology of this area, probably going back 15 years ago, the science that we know today is fundamentally different. And our ability to understand what these animals need in their range is changing, and that allows us to be able to better shape any initiatives that we put in place to be able to help them maintain these migratory pathways. So back to that initial slide, let's take a look at how far are these animals moving. And if you've been paying attention to those squiggly marks on the map, you might have an idea of who the champion is. But just out of the gates, bighorn sheep are traveling about 20 miles for their migration. And to be specific here, we're talking about when they leave their winter grounds and they make it to their summer grounds, or vice versa. how far is that distance in between? And right now we're going to talk about the longest recorded migration distance for these species. So it's possible that a population of bighorn sheep only travels 10 miles, but the longest recorded migration distance is 20. The next one here is moose, traveling roughly the longest recorded migration distance is 65 miles. Next up is bison, traveling about the same at 70 miles. And then elk, a big jump here, up to 168 miles. Then pronghorn, 200 miles. And finally, the winner, mule deer, 255 miles. So to give you a sense, when GPS collars were invented, it completely changed everything about how we understand wildlife movements. We had no idea that these migrations were happening on this scale. And part of the confusion around it is that if we were to go back to the map, this squiggly map here, it's really confusing. You can see that all these different populations are overlapping at different points in their range. And you also have some individuals that overwinter in their summering grounds. So it's all very, very confusing. So if you're someone in an area, you might observe mule deer throughout the year, and yet you had a population of deer or some deer that lived in that area in the summer who have actually migrated as far as 255 miles to be able to make it to their wintering grounds. And so this is absolutely amazing, and it has, as you can imagine, so many implications for what do we do about this. You know, obviously it's an incredibly expensive and challenging issue that wildlife are killed on roadways, and vehicle wildlife collisions are one of the most expensive problems that we have in the United States, let alone the loss of life that you have. And so, you know, understanding where these wildlife are moving, where they're crossing roads, and what pathways they're using in real time allows us to think about where do we want to put wildlife crossing infrastructure in place to help them get across some of these barriers. And there are a lot of photographers and artists who are covering this and trying to bring it into the foreground. And one of those definitely to check out is Joe Reese, R-I-I-S. And he actually works with the Wyoming Migration Initiative and has a huge camera trap system where he's cataloging the movements of these animals and the challenges that they're facing. So why are they migrating? And obviously some of them are not migrating, so some of them are finding food. But one of the reasons why these animals are migrating is that in the fall, we're starting to see changing temperatures, and we're also starting to see plants are senescing, they're dying back. And so at this point in time, the plant material is less nutritious, it's less available, it's shifting. And in addition to that, some ecosystems are actually starting to produce berries or things that are drawing animals into a new location. So animals are following that food availability or the lack of food. In addition, at this time of year, animals are changing. So one of the things that's happening with a lot of the wildlife in this area is that they're going through what we call the rut. So the rut is when animals are changing their behavior as they go into mating season. So for each of these animals, it looks very different. The one that you'll see the most behaviors with, because they're so present in the landscape, is bison. And so these pictures were taken last year. We actually had this really unique instance happen where because of the extensive flooding that happened in Lamar Valley, they had closed most of Lamar Valley, if not all of Lamar Valley, but they opened it just for guided tours of specific companies who had passes. And so we were able to, in our tour last year in about September, we were able to literally open the gate to Lamar Valley and go up into Slough Creek and hang out with bison. We're the only ones in that area during that time of year. Literally no other vehicles in the entire stretch from the gate at Tower Junction all the way up to Slough Creek. And if you've been there, you know that that's the most unique experience you could ever have. And it was amazing because in the past when I've observed bison, I always thought they really are just behaving as if people are not there. And what was interesting is that because we were the only ones on this stretch of road, I started to realize that their behaviors are impacted by people and the vehicles that come through, even if we're respectful. And so it's really interesting to see all of the bison just take over the roadways, and they were walking down the center line of the road, and just the road is covered in cow patties, and it was just a really amazing experience. But it allowed us to really, in our vehicles with the roof hatches open, get to have some really close and personal interactions with these bison. And during this time of year, they're incredible, especially the bulls are incredibly aggressive. And what they're doing is the larger bulls are vying, they're competing for the females. And part of what they're doing is they're constantly surveying one another, and they have what's called a vomeronasal organ, and it helps them detect pheromones. And so you'll see instances where perhaps a cow is urinating and the male will come over, and they start to push their noses out and open their mouths, and that's why this bull here has its tongue in its nose. It had just been doing this behavior where it's actually opening up those pathways into their nose to be able to draw in more of the chemicals so that they can start to get a reading on the health of the animal that they're sniffing. And so as we were watching, I was on a tour with a few middle school boys on this trip in particular, and one of the bulls just started drinking the urine of the female cow bison. And so the behaviors are very bizarre and stunning. The other thing that you'll see is that these animals will create wallowing pits, and these pits themselves are just areas where they roll on their backs to be able to try and break off all of that winter fur, because it's kind of stuck on them throughout the year. And the other thing during the rut is that they'll urinate in their wallowing pit and then just coat themselves in their urine to be able to advertise how healthy they are and to show that they're a viable mate. The other thing that they do is they'll tussle with each other, they'll compete with each other, and here you're seeing a couple of baby bison who are already practicing for those rut behaviors. Elk are really unique in the fall. They have this incredible bugle that they do, and they use that bugle to be able to advertise their own health and viability. The deeper the bugle, the more resonant it is. It tells other male elk in the area that there is a contender, if not a winner. And elk are actually have an interesting behavior where they gather bull elk gather huge groups of female elk, and these are called harems, and they are protecting that harem for a very long time in the fall while they're mating with all of those female elk. And you'll see these incredible sparring events where males will be tussling with each other to be able to compete for ownership over that harem. And again, they also have a vomeronasal organ. They're also, spending a lot of time sniffing and trying to detect whether or not they are the dominant male in the area. And if you ever get the opportunity to be able to hear elk bugling, it is unlike any. The only thing it's similar to is a loon call, but if that loon had this really deep, resonant oof at the end of its call. It's the kind of thing that I did some research on elk calls and the frequency of elk calls in relation to weather. And so I spent a lot of time out listening to elk bugle and recording the frequency of elk bugling. And it's the kind of sound that it just goes right into your chest. And if you ever get to hear a wolf howl, which is another opportunity on the trip, it's a similar feeling of just being transported and just feeling like you're part of something bigger. So this is another incredible thing to witness and behavior that's happening. So another reason why wildlife are migrating, snow is coming. And so a huge part of what these animals are doing is coming out of these alpine meadows, which in the summer are filled with really nutritious plants, but in the winter they just get buried in snow. So a lot of these migrational pathways are just coming out of those higher alpine environments and coming down into the valley, getting away from those areas where there's a really, really deep snowpack, because a lot of these animals have a tough time in the snow. So this is a picture of a moose along the Snake River in Grand Teton National Park. I was fly fishing at the time, and this moose was just coming through this riparian zone. And they have dew claws on their hooves, and those dew claws actually help suspend them in the snow. As you can see, he's sinking quite a bit into the snowpack, but that extra surface area does keep them on top a little bit more. But if you can remember, moose are not traveling very far in the winter. Most of them somewhere between 20 and 40 miles from their summering and winter grounds. That record-breaking moose was up in the like 65-mile range. But essentially, moose are not traveling very far because it's really tough for them to move through the snow in the winter. So they just want to get to a food-dense area where they can feed throughout the winter and not spend very much energy. Here you've got elk. And elk really move down into the flats, and they get out of their alpine meadows, they get down into the flats. And something interesting that's happening with elk in particular is that there was a winter population of elk that overwintered essentially in Jackson Hole in the town and south of Jackson Hole. And when that town was developed, it essentially created this bottleneck so that they couldn't reach their wintering grounds, and it really destroyed a lot of their habitat. And so some of those first winters after development there were just elk die-offs on the hundreds and the thousands of individuals dying off. And so the National Elk Refuge was established and is still running today, and that's where this picture was taken. And these areas are places where we're trying to supplement the feed of the animals, or actually the US government is feeding these animals in a very studied, controlled way to be able to try to maintain historic levels of elk in this area because their wintering grounds were taken away from them. Obviously, this is a really contentious and debated issue, but definitely one to dive into for another chat. We won't have time to cover it on today's chat. Bison are interesting. They do not travel very far in their migration, but if you look at how far they move within their summer range, they travel 1,000 miles, and that's just moving around, finding the most nutrient-dense grass. And bison are ecosystem engineers, meaning they're actually changing the way that the ecosystem functions by their existence. And what that means in the spring, to give you the Cliff Note version, they're chasing the spring green up. So they actually come through, and as the plant is at its most nutritious moment, when it's greening up in the spring, they're finding that moment and moving across the landscape with it. And as they move across, they graze so heavily as a group that they actually encourage further growth of those plants to become even more nutritious as they regrow. And so bison being present on the landscape encourages greater plant growth, more nutritious plant growth. And so we're studying it as a potential climate solution, because places where bison are grazing are actually storing more carbon. And that's why we're starting to see more bison farms coming in than cattle farms, because bison farms tend to, if they're grazed properly, if they're managed properly, help store more carbon in the soil just by the way that they graze and their presence in the landscape. But for the purposes of this talk, to come back to the why are they migrating, what do they do in the winter, these animals are not migrating very long distances between their summer and winter grounds because they have this huge bulldozing head and horns, and they've got this huge muscle. Their trapezius muscle is gigantic, and they have modified vertebra that actually have these big spines on their backs that help them attach that muscle to their head and just plow through the snow. So even in the depths of winter, when there's 5, 6, 7 feet of snow on the ground, they're able to find areas where it's windswept, and then they can burrow through the snow to be able to get down and feed. Other animals are able to sit on top of the snowpack. So even in an area like this, these are wolf tracks moving across a ridge line. just outside of Grand Teton National Park. And so some animals have a better time than the ungulates because they're able to sit right on top of the snowpack. So they might be able to stay in their summer grounds longer or even throughout the entire winter because they're able to be a little bit more adapted to that ecosystem. So obviously there's a ton of information that we could go into in terms of what's happening with the rut and what's happening with wildlife movements and what animals are doing at this time of year. I'll definitely have a lot more to report back of what's happening this year after I get out there next week. But for now, I want to just give you a sense of what the itinerary is like if you were to travel with Natural Habitat Adventures and World Wildlife Fund. So it is a 7-day itinerary, and it's either leaving from Bozeman and traveling down to Jackson as a one-way trip, or it's doing the reverse. This Saturday, I'll be doing the reverse. I'll be starting in Jackson. And really the primary objective is to search for wildlife and to observe the incredibly unique aspects of America's first national park. So day one starts on the Jackson departure, starts in Jackson, Wyoming, and is a lot of wildlife viewing. This is a scene taken from the Gros Ventre Mountains looking back towards the Tetons. This is not necessarily an area that we go on the tour, but if you add on a day on the front end, this is a place that you could go on your own. There are so many areas that can be explored. I lived in Kelly, Wyoming, and it's just this unbelievable environment with so many wildlife viewing opportunities. So this day is really special. You start in, you've stayed overnight in Jackson, and then the next day we explore Grand Teton National Park. And part of this day, the next day, is actually getting out on a Snake River float trip. And this is just spectacular. You're right in the face of the Tetons. You're floating through sections of the river that Ansel Adams took these iconic photos of, so you can start to recognize those scenes. And it's incredible wildlife viewing. So we've seen a lot of amazing water fowl. So we've seen a lot of pelicans and cormorants and eagles, osprey. And then you also have an opportunity to see otters or moose in this area. So it's a really special day in Grand Teton. The next day we make our way up into Yellowstone National Park and we do a geothermal day. So we're really starting to look at what's some of the evidence that we're actually on top of this gigantic supervolcano. So you get to see hot springs and geysers and a lot of the iconic geothermal features that you see if you're watching a National Geographic feature. On day 4, this is one of our big wildlife viewing days, and we also visit the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River. And we go to a place called Artist Point, which actually has a really amazing history in the formation of the park. Thomas Moran was a painter who was hired by the US government to actually go to Yellowstone and try to capture the majesty of this place. And this picture here with Nat Hebb is taken right at Artist Point, looking up to the falls, exactly where Thomas Moran created his huge composition of his painting, trying to capture all of the colors and this unique environment. And on the left here, you're seeing the Yellowstone River as well. On day 5, we make our way into Lamar Valley. This is what makes this itinerary and Natural Habitat Adventures itinerary really special. We spend a lot of time in the Northern Range, and that gives us the best possible chance to be able to see wolves. So these 2 days in Lamar Valley are really spectacular. Here you're seeing and on the right, you're seeing a picture of lunchtime near the van in Slough Creek. And these wildlife viewing days are the ones where we're waking up early. We're trying to get out at the times of day when animals are out and give ourselves the best chance for viewing opportunities for these wildlife that we really want to see. On the left here, this individual is Wolf 926F, and her story is absolutely incredible. At this end of the presentation, I'll share a link to a publication that I put together, and one of the stories features her story as well. So day 7, we head to Bozeman, and this is our departure day. So we make our way up, and there's beautiful scenery and more wildlife viewing on the way. And then Bozeman is a wonderful city to be able to explore and be able to recap everything that we experienced on the trip together, and then head out. So that's the itinerary. I'm getting incredibly excited to be out there with the guests next week. It's really just it's a magical time to be in the area. You know, you've got aspen trees that are turning yellow and gold and red, and it's just elk that are bugling. So really excited to get out there, and perhaps some of you are on the trip with me. So if you enjoyed the photography that you've seen today, you can check out my work at twoline.com, and you can head to the gallery in particular to be able to see images from Grand Teton and Yellowstone. And if you're interested in signing up for my publication, Two Line Tracks, you can head to the website and go to Tracks, where you're going to find a lot of information on peatlands right now. But this is where you'll also find that article on 926F. It's called Valley of the Wolves. And if you'd like to get in touch, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me by email, follow me on Instagram. Right now, I'm doing a lot of work on northern peatlands and talking about how they are one of the most important ecosystems in terms of climate change solutions. So we've talked a lot as a society about permafrost and about how these ecosystems, peatlands that are thawing, are going to contribute a lot of greenhouse gas emissions on a scale that's really scary. But we haven't been talking a lot about the incredible solutions that they present. And there are some degraded peatlands around the world that can be restored, and we can study these ecosystems to understand what is going to happen with them in the future. And so this body of work is really featuring peatlands right outside my door. This one in particular, these are aerial images facing straight down on this incredible ecosystem called Spring Pond Bog in the Adirondack Park. And this work will actually be featured in an exhibit this fall. So October 16th is the gallery opening at the Richard F. Brush Art Gallery. I'll be exhibiting alongside a collective of artists who are investigating the rights of water. So Listening to Water is the name of the exhibition, and it's a group of scientists and indigenous leaders who are coming together to be able to talk about how we can better protect our waterways and all of the creatures, including ourselves, that rely on them. So I would love to turn my attention to taking questions. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Charlie. Now, before we start with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everybody that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So let's get to a couple of these questions. So during the bitter winter months, when the trees have shed their leaves and the grasses and other plants are dormant and have died, what kind of vegetation is available to be fed upon?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it really depends on the species. The one that comes to mind in particular is pronghorn. They're so well adapted. You know, one of the plants in this ecosystem that's so abundant is sagebrush, but it's also one of the plants that most animals cannot eat because it has a chemical that's really toxic and bitter. And so pronghorn have adapted to be able to handle that toxin. And so for them, they would much prefer the sedges and various other plants. But as those sedges become less available, they'll actually start to eat sagebrush. And moose, as you could see during this season, in that image that I shared earlier in the presentation, they were feeding on rose hips. So rose plants, wild rose, the beautiful pink flowers that you'll see will eventually become these really nutritious berries in the fall, and so the moose will start going for that. A lot of the ungulates that are transitioning from their high meadows where they're having dense forage, that's really a lot of sedges and grasses, they're coming down into the valleys and they're still feeding on those same things. They just are a little bit less nutritious. And this actually brings up a really good point thanks for the questions, because a lot of what they're doing as they head into winter is just trying to spend as little energy as possible while still eating enough to survive. And so they've built up all these fat stores over the summer. They're feeding like crazy. You know, we didn't talk about bears, but they're going through what's called hyperphagia right now, where they just put on as much fat as possible. And a really kind of neat factoid there is that the more fat the females put on will determine how many babies they deliver over the winter. And so you gotta, you know, eat as much as you can in the summer and then switch your food source as you move into the fall based on what becomes available. And then you're also trying to minimize how much energy you're expending. And that's part of why these animals are traveling 255 miles, because on one hand, that seems like a huge energy investiture, but on the other hand, they're getting themselves into a southern environment where during the winter, when it's the harshest conditions, they can still get forage easily because it's not covered in snow as much, and there's more food available. So, you know, that hopefully that answers your question a little bit. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that. So, besides scarcity of food, what are some of the other things that the elk have to deal with that cause them issues for their existence?
Yeah, that's another great question, and kind of related to the elk feeding grounds that we were talking about earlier. Elk have a number of diseases that they're susceptible to, and a few of them are pretty scary. And so the other aspect of it is that, you know, one of the big ones that you'll hear about is brucellosis, and these diseases can be spread through saliva. And so in these areas where elk are being fed, initially it really congregated them in artificially close environments where they're feeding on these piles of food and they're exchanging fluids, and it is just a breeding ground for a lot of really tough things. And so these feeding grounds have gotten pretty savvy about how to spread out the food. So there are tractors that are actually going out on these big areas in the winter and dispersing the food pellets in their alfalfa pellets, which are, you know, that typically they would be hayed in the summer, fall, and then turned into pellets to be able to have this really nutrient-packed meal. And then how much they're fed is varied. So they're trying to make it so that elk aren't just drawn to this area because it's so easy to get food. They're hoping that elk will mix how much forage they're eating with the alfalfa pellets. So it's pretty amazing. There are so many people researching elk in their wintering grounds because there's a team of people that's essentially deciding how many pellets to put out each day or each week. And they're looking at the availability of forage, essentially how much grass is still on the ground that the elk haven't eaten. And then they're trying to supplement it so that the elk don't just clear out all the grass for the whole winter. So they're trying to keep it a mix. But that's a huge debate, and there are a lot of people that believe that the elk refuge is not a good thing for the health of the species. And we'll definitely follow along closely as the wild equivalent of mad cow comes through that area. That could really change what we do and how we do it in that area. So really good question. There are a lot of, you know, hoof rot is another one that's a big challenge for elk, which essentially is a bacteria that, or I can't remember if it's a bacteria or fungus that gets into their hooves, and you'll see them limping in the winter. And if they can't move around successfully, that can be a huge issue, and that will be their demise. So a lot to contend with. But one of the really interesting aspects of the story is that elk are healthier with wolves in the ecosystem. And so wolves, obviously, they were removed from this ecosystem in the early 1900s, extirpated locally by the US government. And eventually they were reintroduced in 1995. And since then, we've been studying the impact that wolves have had on the ecosystem. And essentially that apex predator, when it was missing, it allowed elk to just feed rampantly wherever they wanted. And it really caused a lot of erosion. The elk population was not healthy because the wolves were not culling the sick individuals. And so wolves have been this huge success story in terms of ecosystem restoration, because just them being on the landscape, it has changed how elk move around in it, and has changed the health of those elk populations as well. Thank you for the question.
Great, thank you. So what ungulates are susceptible to wolfpack predators?
Yeah, definitely all of them. Every one of those animals is susceptible. Elk are the primary prey species of all of the apex predators in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but wolves can take down all of the ungulates, but they'll spend most of their time after elk and after young bison, injured bison, and the bighorn sheep are a little bit tougher because they're in a really niche habitat. They spend their winters on the cliffs, so they're really, really hard to reach. I mean, there's that image that I shared earlier. And so, you know, a wolf isn't going to spend as much time trying to pursue that. That would more be like the mountain lion territory. But all of these can be hunted by wolves and are. Yeah.
Great, thank you for addressing that. So why don't more animals in the northern latitudes hibernate like bears do during the winter months, since it's such a good way to conserve energy?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, that's a big question. That hibernation is one that we're still studying. We're still trying to understand all the aspects of it and how it works. You know, all of the strategies that you see animals use or deploy to survive have been developed through just this big mosaic of pressures on each of those animals, and also limitations of their biology, or limitations of adaptations that have popped up over time. So that it's a tough question to answer, but you know, part of the answer of that question is just that they have a strategy that is successful for them. You know, whether it's migrate or be able to go into a lower activity level. One of the kind of fun facts about moose is that they actually do really well in the winter. In the summer, they can get quite stressed out. They reduce their activity level because they get so overheated in warm temps, and so they'll just be seeking out shade during the most of the day and be more active in the morning and at night. So they actually, you know, not in the harsh winter, but through the colder months, they do really well. So it's definitely a game of survival, and it's pretty amazing that these animals can survive in this harsh ecosystem. And one of the things I like to remember, and especially for folks that are traveling to this ecosystem and they only see it in one season, it's amazing to think of all the adaptations that these animals have to be able to survive the harsh conditions that happen in every season of the year. To be able, you know, in the summer it can get really hot in these ecosystems, and then in the winter to have negative 50-degree days, strings of days, and harsh winds and deep snow. It's really amazing that the wildlife can survive and thrive in this area. Thank you for that question.
So what allows those bighorn sheep to climb so high? And are there many of them that slip and fall?
Yeah, that's a great question. They are amazing. They have a really soft hoof. The center of their hoof is soft, and that allows it to grip the rock. And then they just have an incredible ability to balance. They are just so nimble, and they have that immediately when they're born. You'll see incredibly young bighorn sheep just on the cliffside with their parents. Yes, it happens. They can fall. You know, perhaps there's a loose rock that they step on, but you know, I've never seen it. They're absolutely amazing animals.
Is it unusual for mountain lions to prey on wolves?
Yeah, I'd have to look into that. I would imagine that would be really rare. Yeah, it's a good question. The only instance I can think of either way would be if there was you know, all animals, all predators are opportunistic, right? So if the right opportunity presented itself, anything can happen. In particular, I'm thinking about cubs and pups. You know, if the opportunity presented itself, if a wolf came across a den while the adult cougar was not present, or vice versa, you know, that would definitely happen, but they're not going to seek each other out. And the mountain lion is the top dog. That is the apex of the apex predators.
Great, thank you for that. So if a wolf dies, do other wolves eat him for a meal?
No, and to my knowledge, that's not their typical behavior. That the wolves, you know, maybe the stat that you're thinking of, if you've read about wolves, one of the amazing stats is that until recently, and we can talk about that a little bit, the primary form of death in wolf populations is by other wolves. They're incredibly territorial, and so within their pack, they can even have fights within the pack or between packs, and a lot of wolves will die from that. But recently, because hunting has been allowed outside of Yellowstone National Park when wolves are delisted from the Endangered Species Act, there's been enough hunting pressure that in the last like 10 years, that stat has been overtaken. That typically it's wolf on wolf that is the highest rate of death, but recently it's been hunting. But yeah, that's a good question.
So if I were to visit Yellowstone, is this a good time to see all the different colors, or is it a little early?
Every year is different. This is a good time. You know, one of the things that you have an advantage of in this trip and in this region is elevation. So the fall color is going to happen at higher elevation first, and then it'll slowly move its way down the valley. And so this is a good time. The next 2 weeks are a good time. The next 3 weeks are a good time. It just, as you're moving through the different ecosystems and the different elevations throughout the trip, you'll have different experiences in terms of fall color. But there's never a bad time to visit.
A great point. So what is it like in the late spring, early summer? Is it really hot at that point?
Yeah, so I only guide about 4 trips a year right now for Natural Habitat Adventures. The rest of my time I'm doing photography with my business, Two Lens Studio. But this year I did guide at the last week of May, 1 trip, and the first week of June. And that time is absolutely phenomenal. Just like the fall, there's a lot of interesting things happening from a wildlife perspective, like wolves are denning at that point. So they're more, you know, predictable in their movements as far as where you might find them, especially if the den is near the roadways or an area that is easy for viewing. The other thing that's happening at that time of year is spring flowers. And you have these incredible wildflowers in the valleys, and later in the season, towards the middle of the summer, you'll start to see them in the high alpine environment. But that's a really exciting time, and you also have at that time baby season. So baby elk, baby bears, baby bison, all of the babies. So this last spring, May, June was really an amazing time for that, and typically it's a time that is lower visitation in the park, so you have a little bit more of the park to yourself. With that said, NatHab does a great job. I talked earlier about we go out when the animals are active, and that's also when people tend to be less active. So we'll have early mornings to be able to see the wildlife, and then maybe we'll have a midday break to be able to rest, and then be able to get out for the crepuscular animals that are more active in the evening and morning. Yeah.
So what is a daily itinerary like on the trip? Are you up at 5 or 6, driving, hikes, snacks? Can you maybe talk about maybe what a day in the life would be like?
That's a great question. It really depends on the day. With that said, each day has kind of the regular components. We try to make sure that the first couple days you're getting some good rest. If you're going from Bozeman to Jackson on that southward bound trip, we're going to dive into the really early mornings right away because we'll be in Lamar Valley, and that's really the time when we want to try and see wolves, we want to try and see bear. You can see those things, those animals at any point in the trip, but the northern range is really where we have the best likelihood of seeing those creatures. And so we, on these mornings, and also it depends on the group, but we try to get out really early. So for me, my ideal Lamar Valley day is a 5 a.m. departure, get out into Lamar Valley. And because we're staying in Cook City, you're really, really close. You're about 20 minutes from the entrance of Yellowstone. And at any point in that drive, you could have wildlife viewing opportunities. So once you're in Lamar Valley, you're driving around, and we're training everyone in on how to use binoculars and scopes. And part of it is getting out of the van and looking through the scope to be able to see if there's any wildlife in the area. And sometimes we're seeing what activity is happening that other people are already seeing. So sometimes there will be cars pulled off, and we'll arrive, we'll get out of the vans, we'll get the scopes set up, and then we'll start talking about what we're seeing. And I've never been disappointed. You know, some people are coming and really want to see a wolf, or they really want to see a bear or some particular interaction. And I've never had someone who hasn't seen the thing they were coming for come away without just an incredible experience, because no matter what you see, you're in this place that's just jaw-dropping. It's just unlike anywhere else, in my mind, in the world. And you just get to see some amazing things, regardless of whether it's the iconic moment that you're thinking of. With that said, because we're doing that early departure morning, you've got the best chance to be able to experience that. So we're driving around doing scopes. We'll typically do, you know, field breakfast or a field lunch to be able to stay out as long as possible. Perhaps we'll get back to Cook City for a meal. And a lot of this will kind of depend on what the wildlife are doing. If we've had an incredible morning of wildlife viewing, maybe we take a break midday to give you time to explore Cook City. Maybe we have a beautiful picnic lunch and watch the bison hang out in the valley. So it's a little bit tough to give you like concrete idea, but we always feed you well. We always have incredible food. We always try to give you the best possible opportunity for wildlife viewing, and we get to just spend a week together in one of the most beautiful places. So it's a really neat experience. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a better idea of what a day looks like, but it does vary depending on what wildlife are doing, where they're active. You know, we might be driving a little bit more or driving a little bit less depending on where wildlife are spending their time at that particular week, day, or season. So it's really about having guides that know where to go and how to bring you that experience, and then kind of being flexible to be able to see what that experience is going to be on the trip that you are on. You know, like I said, I've never been disappointed.
Is there a lot of walking and hiking on the trip?
You know, this trip, and part of what we have is you'll always have two, as long as your departure has more than 7 people, you'll always have 2 guides, which means 2 vehicles, which means that you have flexibility. So if we have a group that is very much wanting to do sightseeing and wants to do limited amounts of walking or hiking, we can cater to that. If we have a group that's split, where some people want to hike more and some people want to hike less, but I would say this is not a heavy hiking trip. You know, if this is a wildlife viewing trip with opportunities to be able to stretch your legs and opportunities for a little bit bigger hikes, depending on kind of the interest of the group and how it all works together. But that's part of the beauty of the way that this trip is designed, is you've got 2 guides to be able to deliver slightly different experiences to the same group, to be able to cover the bases if folks want to hike or spend more time observing the wildlife.
So if I'm arriving early or if I'm staying an extra day, in Jackson or in Bozeman. Are there operators, or is there anything you can recommend for us to provide experiences to maximize our opportunities while we're there?
That's a great question. I mean, it would really come down to like what you're looking for. There are amazing tours for any number of things, whether you're hoping to extend wildlife or tag on a fishing trip. I would just recommend that the NatHab scheduling team has a lot of really amazing recommendations, and then just kind of learning about these places. Search things to do in Jackson Hole. I went to Teton Science Schools in Kelly, Wyoming for my graduate program. And so that entity also provides wildlife expeditions as well. But there, you really can't go wrong. I highly recommend spending more time on either end if you are going to do this trip, just because you'll get to go at a different pace. You'll get to enjoy certain places that we might not have time for otherwise. And both of those places are just absolutely amazing to spend time in. Obviously, I'm biased because I lived in Kelly, Wyoming. Jackson Hole is really amazing to explore. And I would say that we don't have as much, we could add on a whole week just in Jackson Hole and still have more things to see. So yeah, you can really do anything that you'd like to on either of those ends.
Well, thanks, Charlie. Unfortunately, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for any closing comments you may have for us.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you on a future tour. And if you're interested in learning more about some of the stories that I'm telling, in particular the Northern Peatland project that I'm working on right now, feel free to head to my website or shoot me an email if you have any other questions. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Charlie, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you could send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.